So in case you didn't grasp, my name is Tanja. I work at the Carbon Trust, and the Carbon Trust is a nonprofit organization. We've got offices in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, and in North America. And I'm going to be talking about how to tackle climate change. I'm going to be covering about 5 topics, and they're listed on the agenda, so I won't belabor them, but I hope you can all appreciate the fact that I managed to spell out a word along that list, which has something to do with the General Conference agenda today. Estimates from the United Nations in 2014 suggest that more than half of the global population lived in urban areas then, and we heard from one of the panel speakers earlier today that's about 75% of the EU population that lives in cities. By 2050, that'll have increased globally on average to about 2/3. That's in 33 years. I'm 33 years old. I don't know about the rest of you, but if I look back on those 33 years, they pass by in the blink of an eye. I mean, I can't even imagine how quickly the next 33 years are going to go. I just know all of a sudden it's going to be 2050, and we're going to have a huge increase in the population of cities around the world. Now, just to illustrate, and just instead of proportions, in 2014, we were talking about 3.9 billion people living in cities. In 33 years, that number will have increased by another 2.5 billion people, which is a net increase of 60%. Now, I was at a conference last month, and I believe it was the finance director of the municipality of Pretoria in South Africa who was presenting. And he said, "We have a challenge today. I have 100 days of water left in my municipality. We have no idea when it's going to rain." These are the challenges that cities are facing all over the world, right? I mean, and right next to him, there was a lady from New Zealand who, in case you weren't aware, you know, a couple of weeks ago, or a month ago, they had a massive amount of rainfall and a hurricane. And she was saying, "I'd love to give you some of our water because we've got flooding everywhere and we don't know how to get things dry." Cities are facing increasing challenges, and a lot of them can be traced back to climate change, hence my earlier questions about resilient cities versus climate adaptation. Scrolling down. Nope, next slide. There we go. Yes. So, did I skip one? Nope, that's right. An estimated $14 trillion needs to be invested in low-carbon infrastructure by 2030. So between 2013, which is already passed, and 2030, we're talking about $14 trillion. I can't really connect to that number. That's an absurd figure to me. 14 trillion, I mean, what kind of number? I mean, it's just too immense for me to even picture. So I can try and break it down from you. And I've realized now why the notes aren't showing up on my slides. This is because these are the slides that I had yesterday. So I've uploaded all my old notes, which don't have half of my speaking notes. So you'll, again, have to forgive me if I muddle through a bit. But these 14 trillion dollars break down to about, what was the calculation I did? Breaks down to about $600 million a year for an average sized city that needs to be invested in infrastructure investment every single year. And an average sized city, for the purposes of that calculation, is about 500,000 people. So we're talking about $1,200 per person living in your city that needs to be invested in infrastructure investment every single year. How much of that money is being invested in the three things that I've listed on the slide, which are my top 3 things to look for when you're looking at infrastructure investment. So air quality and climate impact. So air quality, I mean, we've all seen the pictures, right, from all the big cities with smog. You get pictures from Beijing, Shanghai, London. I think there was a region in London, there was a borough. Within the first 5 days of 2017, they already hit their maximum annual allowance for particulate emissions. 5 days into 2017. Air quality issues are immensely important for all cities, and transport is a key component of that. Now, I think the best way to illustrate this is to tell you a bit about my childhood. I had an absolutely fascinating childhood. I grew up partially in Bangkok, the capital city of Thailand, which at the time had a population of 6 million people. I also partially grew up on a very small island in Denmark, which had a population of 5,000 people. My grandmother lived there. And it's a rural farming community. Interestingly, though, my first job out of university was on this island, and I actually did the same thing there that I now do in London. So I had the exact same job content on an island of about 4,000 people as I do in London, which has a population of 10 million. But I chose to move to London to do the same job, and that's not a unique trend, right? A lot of people are choosing to move to cities, moving away from rural areas into cities. And cities generate more than 80% of the world's GDP, and we use more than 70% of the energy, and they're exciting places to live in. And in the meantime, you can see that when I was growing up in Bangkok, population of 6 million, today it's over 10 million. The island I was talking about, though, it had a population of 5,000. It's now less than 4,000. It's actually hitting 3,500 last time I checked. And what really strikes me about that comparison of growing up in those two very disparate areas is that the islanders, these 4,000 or 5,000 people, they were extremely obsessed with energy, about being dependent on energy imported from the mainland, which is also part of Denmark, but a completely foreign place. I can only remember that there was 1 or maybe 2 blackouts where we lost electricity for over a period of 5 to 10 years, usually in the winter with really harsh storms. But it was a topic of conversation. It was like the weather. It was a very, very popular dinnertime conversation. Today, they're pretty much self-reliant on energy. They generate most of their own, they generate more electricity than they need, and they also generate most of their own heating needs, and now they're moving on to transportation. They're building a biogas plant on the island so that they can replace the fuel that they need in cars and on the ferry to get to the island. Conversely, Bangkok, back then especially, I think we had a power cut about once a week. And like a lot of houses in the neighborhood that I lived in, we had a backup diesel generator, which was on. And that meant, in addition to all that traffic, which at the time was really, really awful, I mean, air quality has increased enormously in Bangkok since I lived there. But it meant that when you came home from school, you had this layer of dust all over your hands and your clothes, and you could see it when you took a shower. Now I live in London, I come home from work in the evenings and I can see the dirt when I wash my face in the evenings because there's so much particulates in the air there as well. And I mean, you'll all be familiar because I can see a lot of white and light blue shirts and pink shirts. You get this dirt, I forget what the word is, but around your collar, on the inside of your collar, and that's, partially sweat, but it's mixed with the particulates that are in the air and that we're breathing. Cities need to plan energy security into their energy infrastructure. Otherwise, they expose themselves to the vulnerabilities from import dependencies, grid constraints, and knock-on effects of pollution and carbon emissions. Businesses, in particular, they're attracted by long-term energy supplies, stable, secure ones. And citizens, in turn, they're attracted by employment and quality of living. A citywide plan for a resilient and diversified energy supply cost-effectively reduces exposures to economic and political upheaval, and it limits air pollution, and it increases energy efficiency, and it provides long-term stability, and in fact, it's just a really, really good idea to have. Now, I primarily work with middle-sized and larger-sized public sector organizations in the work that I do. So that means hospitals and universities. Now, a lot of the hospitals, universities, and other organizations I work with, they choose to generate their own energy on site rather than rely on what's available in their region. Now, they do this for 2 reasons. One is because they want the security of being able to plan long-term on having an energy supply that they can plan around over a 20-year period, and they don't feel that they have that when they're relying on what's available in the region. The other reason is that they want to decarbonize more quickly than the region around them wants to. that's not great. That implies that businesses can't rely on the region that they're in, the city that they're in, to satisfy their needs to meet their energy supply cost effectively and carbon effectively. If they could, then they wouldn't have to mobilize themselves and transport. That's a great other example of that, because most people choose to buy a private car, or have chosen in the past particularly, because it's the most convenient way of getting around, most convenient, most cost-effective way of getting around. If public transport was as convenient or more convenient than having your own private car, then you wouldn't need a car. So that's also a breakdown in the market. But and it comes back to this infrastructure challenge. And that was the number I was saying before. So sorry, my notes are on these slides. They're completely back to forward, and then that shows you why you shouldn't be working on your slides the night before you do a presentation, so my apologies. Cities represent more than 70% of the, oh my God, this entire slide is so old. I don't know what happened to my presentation. I'm going to have to wing it, sorry. All those notes are completely wrong. Right, first off, what I can tell you is the picture on that slide, in case it's not really obvious, that's a row of light bulbs. Now, on this slide, I had some further information which was going to be very, very interesting, but since I can't bloody remember it anymore, excuse my language, that's very frustrating. Oh well, I'm going to have to come back to that. Hopefully I'll remember it on the next slide, which also doesn't have the 3 pages of A4 that I had written that I was going to talk through. Never mind. Results-based decision-making is one of these fancy modern consultancy terms, and I am a fancy modernish consultant, so it's one I gotta use. I don't know how many of you are already familiar with results-based decision-making. Can I have a quick show of hands? For those of you who aren't glorifying in my embarrassment and my nerves up here. No? No? Okay. Well, it's very strongly advocated by the OECD and the World Bank, and I know the European Commission has started to talk a lot about it as well. It's about, and there was a really lovely, really boring and dull definition I was going to read to you, but now I don't have it anymore, so I'm just going to skip to the part where I explain what it means, which is you start from where it is you want to end, and then you work your way backwards. Now, it works like any other kind of journey. So for example, to get to Lisbon, that's where I wanted to go, I had the choice between choosing multiple different travel options. There was plane, train, walking, biking, hydroplane, jetpacks, anything you can think of in order to get to Lisbon. There's a time element. So some of them would take more time than I would have available to get there. So for example, I love walking, I walk everywhere, but if I wanted to walk from London to Lisbon, I might have had to start in like February, because even though I love walking, I'm also incredibly slow at it. That's a side effect of growing up in Bangkok. Another time element, of course, is that the technology you want to use the most to get to Lisbon might not be available yet. So I did see a demonstration recently that they managed to get that Ironman jet boosting thing to work in your hands. That would be an awesome way to travel. I really can't wait for that to happen. But that's not available to me either. So that's not the method to which you could travel to Lisbon. Other elements that you need to factor in are cost, carbon, the social element. Do you need Wi-Fi the whole way so you can get your work done? Is it safe? There's a lot of safety issues, for one reason or the other. My friends were just in a car accident yesterday, so that highlighted again. I was on the train, they were in a car, there was a car accident. Train accidents happen all the time as well, so there's also a safety element to consider. And the bulk of this is, so it's about the journey. It's not, so you figure out where it is you go, and then the journey bit gets a lot easier. And the reason why I'm saying this is because a lot of the organizations we work with, because there's so many options available, because there's so many technologies to choose from if you want to implement a smart city. It's just a smorgasbord of opportunities out there. How do you pick the ones that really work for you? And you can get overwhelmed by all the options. So again, if you're looking at traveling to, I wanted to go to Lisbon. If I didn't have that fixed destination in mind, you can easily become overwhelmed by all the different modes of travel you have available to you. Same thing applies when you're looking at getting to the smart, livable city, which is where we want to end up. And how are we going to get there? So a really useful, really old school trick, and I'm saying this because I come from a startup background myself, 2.5 years. It was great. We went tragically bankrupt. It was a huge mess and horribly miserable, especially the last 6 months, but wouldn't trade it for the world. Good luck to all 4 of the startups who presented here today, by the way. My heart will be with you. But what startups are really great at is they sit down at a table with each other and they, oh God, I can't remember that word. What's that name for that? They have a session, brainstorming session. They just sit and they brainstorm. Now, seriously, in organizations, how often does that happen? Like in established institutional organizations, in public sector organizations, how frequently do you sit down with your team and have a completely informal brainstorming session? Saying, this is what we want to do is we want to get to, in 2050, we want to build a city that people don't want to leave. We want to build a city that works, that people are excited about, that's competitive to any other city in the world. That's what we want to be in 33 years. We're in 2017. How do we get from where we are today to where we will be then? People don't have these kind of sessions anymore. It's actually quite sad because it's a great team building and bonding exercise as well. So I would really recommend that everybody thinks about having one soon, some point soon, preferably over pizza and beer because that really stimulates all the brain cells. And while I'm talking about all this, clearly there's a word behind me, a very large word saying fear. And there is a reason why fear is the word that is on that slide. And that's because fear is the #1 hurdle that prevents us from getting to that smart, livable city. Now, if you think of it in terms of children, the smart kids in class, they're the ones who take a risk. They're the ones with their hands up. Hassan, you'll probably love the fact that I'm saying you should open your hands up because it shows that you're willing to take a risk, that you're not afraid. Personally, I'm terrified of voicing my opinion because I know how frequently I'm terribly worried always about sounding stupid, but after a couple of years you get used to sounding stupid, so it just makes the times when you don't sound stupid that much sweeter by comparison. But it's the smart children in class. They're the ones who engage with the teachers. They're the ones who raise their hands. They're the ones who learn from their mistakes. Now, it's human to make mistakes. That's what makes us people. What makes us smart people is learning from those mistakes. You can't build a smart city if you're not willing to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes in the process. Which brings me back to this session, this brainstorming session, which you should have with your team. And it doesn't matter if you're in a public sector organization or a private sector organization. It's always a good idea, all right? And it's great because it's, you don't need to pay any consultants to be there. So you can do it all free and by yourselves, and it doesn't have massive extra costs except for the cost of the pizza and the beer. In order to cultivate you need to cultivate what's it called? An arena where you can make mistakes, where you're allowed to share crazy ideas, and where you don't blame yourself or your colleagues for when things go wrong. And actually, on that note, I should probably ask those of you who are working for a public sector organization, would you mind raising your hands? It doesn't matter if it's a hospital or local government, and don't be afraid, it's not a trick question. I'm not going to make you, say anything horrible. You're the most powerful people in this room. You are the catalyst for everything the world needs to happen. Unfortunately, it's the private sector that gets a lot of the credit, right? You're thinking about electric vehicles, you think about Elon Musk, and you think about the Tesla. You don't think about the public sector employees who had to convince their senior management to say, you know what, we really need to subsidize electric vehicles. That's the way forward. Unfortunately, I don't even know the names of those people, but those are the real heroes in our society, right? And if they're not willing to lead, then we're never going to get there. That doesn't mean that the private sector can just rest and expect everything to be served by the public sector. It just means that we have to acknowledge the fact that the public sector does a tremendous amount of work and are the most underappreciated people in our society. They're kind of like parents. You have a very short window of opportunity in which you can influence your children to a pathway that will lead them to happiness and success. If you're afraid of making mistakes, then you might end up taking them away from that path. Private sector, we're there to help. So, I mean, consultants are kind of like self-help gurus and videos and books, and some of us are useless and some of us aren't, and et cetera. But everybody plays a role in it. So private sector should be about enabling public sector to deliver. And within that context, it's, wow, when I ramble, I really go over time. Sorry, I'll wrap it up in a second. Within that context, I'll skip to the last slide here, which is, that's a part of a front page from a report that was published by C40 and Arup recently, and I'd strongly recommend that you read it if you haven't already. One of the highlight conclusions of that is that we have 3.5 years, and when the report came out, it said 4 years. We have until 2020 to take the actions that will put us on the right trajectory. That means the people in this room who are currently in public sector organizations, your actions will determine whether we meet our 2050 carbon deadlines. Private sector organizations, it's your actions that will determine whether public sector can be enabled to meet those 2050 deadlines. And on that note, I think I'll finish. So thank you. Obrigado.